feel like I need some jaunty music or something. Something. Anything. Um, we need a little logo in the corner. Do we like this one? Or this one? That's the old one. That's the first draft. Or this one? It's like too small. You can't tell it's a TV. We'll take the rabbit ears off. Hello. This is episode 2 of GTV or Grief TV. An episode about grief, or rather, a podcast about grief, a video podcast about grief, and about the many manifestations of grief in us, in our communities, in our nation. This podcast is the result of a independent study that I'm doing on grief because I, in my MSW education, there's not enough, and I feel like, if you're going to come across anything as a clinician or as a therapist, it's going to be grief in your life. There's going to be grief. It's what grief and death are pretty much guaranteed. Not even taxes are guaranteed. So for episode 2, I interviewed Sue Klebold. And Sue is Dylan Klebold's mom. Dylan Klebold was one of the shooters at Columbine High School on April 20th, 1999. Sue and I have worked together in a couple of times. Sue mainly focuses on suicide prevention now. One of the things she realized in her healing process is that, when she lost Dylan, it was a mass tragedy where he murdered a lot of people, where he did something atrocious, but he also ended his own life. And Sue thinks, and she'll say this in the episode, she thinks that, what Dylan did started with suicide, with what he was going through. And Thomas Joyner, who is a leading researcher in the suicidology field, also has a theory about mass killings being based in suicide. I cannot speak to it because I haven't read the book, but there's some meat to that idea. And like I said, I'm interested in exploring grief from maybe some avenues we don't think about as often. There's the grief that we all encounter, or a lot of us encounter, many encounter. I don't, these quantitative words, you lose a parent, or you lose friends as you age, kind of natural losses, losses that we come across in life. You lose your youth. These are all things we have to grieve, but in some cases, like grieving your youth is almost frowned upon. But then we have cases like Sue's, where there are very few people who are in her position. And I know that one of the big parts of her story that struck me when I read her book, A Mother's Reckoning, Living in the Aftermath of Tragedy, was her motherhood experience, losing a son and having to hide away and not be able to openly express that. And I think there are some parallels to COVID, the rituals that we've lost, obviously for different causes. But I think as a mother of 2 young kids, I think about Columbine a lot. I think about Columbine because it deeply affected me as a teenager. I believe I was a sophomore in high school in 1999. And I remember the news that day and the talk of the trenchcoat mafia before anyone knew what was going on and what had happened, really. The live reporting. I remember seeing that and just, being freaked out by it because, that was one of the first times when I started to realize, there are places that I'm absolutely unsafe, and school is one of them where you're supposed to be safe. Um, but then there were they were goths, they were bullied, and there was some part of my identity that, that identified with that. And ultimately, um, I did not identified with it in the sense of, the kind of glorification, romanticism of identifying with people who do things like that. But people already looked down on me because I was goth, and I already stood out like a sore thumb. And then there was this maybe new layer of, how is this going to affect me? And ultimately, what those two boys did that day changed our whole country forever. And now as a mother, I can identify better with what I think she maybe must have been feeling in those days. And I genuinely fear sending my kids into a school building. Um, Back in the days of the Cold War, everyone hid under their desks and did bomb drills, and now we've got, kids doing mass shooter drills, and they're pretty traumatic for them, depending. Well, I don't know if it's depending on the training. I feel like I read about the Alice training that was really an issue, a little too realistic. It's neither here nor there. Sue did point out in the episode that we're not safe anywhere, but I think Columbine was one of the first times where that became very clear, and it changed everything. In similar to like 9/11. 9/11 changed travel forever. Columbine changed education forever, for better or worse. So this episode was not to really dig into what happened there that day in that high school. It's more about, a mother's grief and how complicated it is. It's kind of one of those both and situations. My son murdered a lot of people, and I am grieving for them, and maybe she feels some responsibility for that. And I can't speak to her feelings, but the layers of grief about one thing, while also like, I loved this person who did this terrible thing, and what do I do with that? And why isn't that valid to people, to some people? And I think those are probably two pretty painful truths to hold, really complicated. And I just wanted to talk to her about that. So that's why I invited her. I should also mention that Sue's book, A Mother's Reckoning, the proceeds don't go to her. The proceeds go, I believe, to AFSP, I think the American Foundation for Suicide Prevention, or maybe she switches it up, but they go to suicide prevention, to brain research, to that sort of thing. They all the proceeds go to work done towards preventing suicide, and maybe ideally preventing these huge violent losses. What else was I gonna say? This is the re-record of the intro because I my internet was all screwed up apparently last time I recorded it, and I also forgot what I was gonna say at the end of that one. What was it? I don't know. Anyway, maybe it'll come back to me the moment I stop recording. But since this is episode 2, this is still new. Oh, I remember what I wanted to say. I know there are people who feel sensitive about these things. Thank you. About mass shootings and about the perpetrators of mass shootings. And I think I mean, it's not a difficult empathy for me to have to identify with Sue and to have this conversation, but I know that that's the case for some people based on just, knowing a little bit of Sue's story and the ways that she's been treated over time. So I would really love for you to listen and to watch and to hear what we have to say. But if this is the sort of thing that is upsetting to you, feel free to skip this one, because you do have to have empathy for a really complex situation. So, I think that's worth pointing out. The other thing, episode 2, new podcast. I finally put the website up. I'm still tweaking it a little bit, but it's at grief-tv.com. I think I was supposed to be introducing myself, and maybe I didn't. But late in the game, I'm Desiree Stage, and I got into suicidology, suicide prevention work about a decade ago with a project called Live Through This. It's a series of portraits and true stories of suicide attempt survivors across the US. I've interviewed about almost 200 people over the past 10 years. I've wanted to do suicide work my whole life. I love this topic. It's very personal to me on a few levels. And I think we should be talking about suicide specifically every day, in various ways. Grief. I think all these things are really important, things we need to think about. I also host another podcast called Suicide and Stuff with my friend Jess Stolman-Rainey. I do most of the production, and I do some talking, and Jess is better at facilitating conversations, so she's kind of the main talker. But if you want to see episodes of that podcast, which we've been doing for over a year, there are almost 40 episodes, you can go to suicide-n-stuff.com. I do lots of other stuff, but those are kind of my main big loves. And if I'm repeating myself from before, I don't remember, and I'm probably not going to edit this. So sorry, not sorry. I hope you enjoy the conversation with Sue. I am actively reaching out to people to interview in the future. What I'm finding is that, same with my experience with Live Through This, I can think of 100 different white people that I would like to interview about grief, but I'm having trouble with people of color, and that's on me. It's also a situation where, how are Black, Indigenous people of color supposed to trust me as a white person not to exploit them? There's a lot to work through there, and I'm interviewing my friend Stephanie Willard next week. She lost her daughter Marabella and her husband Jesse in a murder-suicide, and she's also white. And I'm trying to figure out how to do this in a way that I want this to be bigger than white people. I'm sick of things being normed on white people. I want it to be broader, and maybe that means that there are some people of color who don't want me to facilitate that conversation, but do want to have that conversation. So, and maybe there are people who don't want to talk on camera or on audio. So I'm thinking about the ways that the formats this can take in addition to the video podcast, and working that out, and being really conscientious of it and cognizant of it. I worry that, that the fact that the first 3 episodes are all white people, or maybe the first 4 or 5 episodes are all white people. I don't know yet. I just want my viewers to know that I'm thinking about it, and I'm actively working on it, because I'm committed to doing better and being better, for all of us. So I have talked way too long. Enjoy the episode. Let me know what you think. Thanks. So I don't even know how to do an intro. I'm just gonna record it later because I feel so awkward. I just want to talk to you.
Sure. Okay.
But yeah, so I mean, introduce yourself, and then I'll introduce the the episode later. You know,
Okay.
who are you, Sue?
Well, and thank you for inviting me, Des, to be on this program. And you and I have worked together, sat across tables from each other in meetings for a number of years. And I wanted to let you know how much I respect and admire the work that you've done before I begin, because I think you have helped so many people and put yourself out there and then taken great risks. And I appreciate that. And I admire you for that.
Thank you so much.
So I'm Sue Klebold. My son Dylan was one of the two shooters in the Columbine High School tragedy of April 20th, 1999. And he and his friend Eric killed 12 students and a teacher and wounded more than 20 others before taking their own lives. So this was a mass murder. It was a murder-suicide. It was a double murder-suicide. It was all of those things. And before I begin to even talk about my own experience, I want to acknowledge the terrible suffering that he caused to individuals, to their families, to an entire community, and you know, and ask for an audience's indulgence that if I do speak of my son and my own loss, I don't want in any way to diminish the suffering that he caused. And I recognize that, and I am forever sorry for what he did. But I think in this context, you've asked me to talk about my own experience, so I am prepared to do that.
Yeah, I guess we should give that context. Like I was telling you before we started recording, is I want to have a conversation with you about your grief. You know, as a mother, your grief in a community, your grief for your son. And I feel like it's worth saying now that if somebody is watching who can't find empathy in that, and in empathy in Dylan as a person, then they should probably push the stop button. Because I don't, you know, it is a tragedy, but the loss of your child is a tragedy, and what he did wasn't your fault. So I want to have that conversation with you, and I think it's important. So
Thank you.
Yeah, you know, I don't, motherhood changes you. People don't believe it, but it does. And
And one of the challenges of this experience is that, oh, there are many, but for those of us who love people who hurt other people, it is our own grief is not recognized as valid or even permissible, I think, because Dylan killed other people and he hurt other people. Yeah. There is a general sense that his life had no worth. It was less than worthless. It was evil. It was monstrous. And so those of us who have loved ones who do that, who kill other people and then sometimes kill themselves, makes a very complicated grief process, because we have our own grief, which is, in my case, I knew that my youngest child had taken his own life, but before he did that, he killed other people. So I was grieving for the loss of my boy, who was 17 years old. And but the grief is not a pure grief. You don't get loving concern from other people. You know, you don't. And I did have, of course, close friends and family who surrounded me and took care of me. But in terms of the public, there is a trauma because there is this world spotlight on you of hatred and blame and condemnation. And hatred not only for us for raising this child, but for Dylan himself. And this is one of the things I find when I talk with other survivors of murder-suicide loss, is that to us, this murderer, this person who killed others, was a beloved person. They were a family member. They were a child or a father or an uncle or whoever it happened to be. And we listened to the world talk about how evil and monstrous and hateful he was. And that's a very difficult thing. And I've talked to quite a few loss survivors that's one of the biggest pieces of their trauma is the things that are being said about the person that they loved. So there's really a disconnect there. I was in therapy for many years after this. And during that time, the trauma of the media, of being afraid to go somewhere, or being afraid to say my name in public, going to a doctor's office and you're afraid they're going to say, Mrs. Klebold, you keep your head down. But a part of that trauma, of course, is the media, the condemnation. But the other part of it is the grief and the loss that I've just lost my child. Mm-hmm. And fortunately, in the therapy that I went to for many, many years, I had a person who specialized in grief. Mm. And she, I believe, saved my life. She helped me focus on the fact that my job was to grieve, and grieve not only the losses of those he killed, but also to grieve for my son. And when I would go in there and get all upset that we were being sued by 36 families, and I was afraid to get out of my car in the parking lot at work, she would always bring me back to what you're really working with. What is the hardest thing you're working with is your own grief and your own loss. And I spent years working through that grief and that loss. And there were many, many things that she did to help me survive that. And one of the things I realized in those years after losing him was that just because the person you love dies and they are finite and they are gone, that your love for them does not end, that the love goes on even though their lives have ended. And I focused a lot on that. And, she sort of helped me send love to Dylan, like a care package. She would say, even if he's not here, you may have the practice of sending him your love, of doing things in your life that you dedicate to him. And that is sort of consequently how I got really involved with suicide prevention work eventually, mm-hmm. because it was my way of being close to him and saying, I didn't understand in your lifetime what you were going through, what you were feeling, but now maybe I have a little bit better understanding than I did. And so that is one thing about grief. I think we have a concept that grief is something that, it's almost, people believe that it should be in stages, that it ends, you go through this and you're done, you go through this, you're done, then you get to this stage and you're all done. And I have learned that grief does not end, it changes. I believe that recovering from traumatic loss there's really no such thing as recovery. If you think recovery means I'm done with it, what really happens is integration. You learn to integrate that loss into who you are. And if you can draw strength from it or meaning from it, then that's very fortunate. But in reality, we learn to see ourselves and the world around us differently because of that loss. And I think for many of us, there's a post-traumatic growth where we take that loss that changed our lives so much, and we can accept the ways that made us a better person, maybe made us less judgmental or more empathetic, or maybe it was a driver for serving others or doing some kind of work to help others who are in similar circumstances. So that's the kind of takeaway that I have. But I dreamed about Dylan last night. Woke up sad, woke up feeling depressed. Have my Kleenex right here, excuse me. But yes, it doesn't stop. I mean, I still think of Dylan. I still dream of Dylan. I still have nightmares that he is in danger and I'm trying to save him, or that he is a threat to other people and I'm trying to get him not to do what he is destined to do. But those are just things that I just see as part of living with what I experienced. And there were moments when I felt angry at him, where I judged him and I thought this was a horrible thing to you. You didn't have to choose to do this. But from what I have learned about suicide and about a suicidal state of mind, I think the word choose has different interpretations. And I think that when someone's state of mind is such that they are so vulnerable and they have lost access to their tools of self-governance and self-care, that we cannot even use the word choose, that we're not really choosing to do these things. I think it's more of a default that happens. So, this is my own thinking, my own building a construct for how I have coped with this. And I think that's what all of us do when we're recovering from loss, is we build our own constructs for what happened. And we learn to live with whatever it is that we create and we end up believing.
Yeah, especially if, they don't leave anything personal behind, I would imagine.
No.
Yeah, I mean that's the huge that's one of our biggest questions with suicide is why, right?
Why? And I asked that question, why, of course, from the moment that I heard this was happening, and they the news was saying they thought my son was a perpetrator, and I thought, well, that can't be right. It must have been a prank. It must have been some kind of theater they were doing. And then I learned that he had died, and I learned that he had taken his own life. And the first question we always ask is why, because for those of us who have never experienced that level of suicidality, we can't understand how anybody could think that, could even be in that state of mind. But I have come to learn that the more helpful question to ask is how. How does someone get to that place? And if by asking the question how and not why, because we'll never answer why, but I think how, understanding how we get to that place and how we can intervene and try to help people, that's the question I choose to focus on, because that is an actionable question. If you can see that someone is progressively becoming more preoccupied with their own death, with taking their life, then that is a process. I mean, we can intervene in that process. We can step in and do something about that. And so for me, the question that we should be asking is, how does someone get to this place? And then there's a wealth of things that we can do. It's about connection. It's about understanding mental wellness. It's about reaching out for help. It's about expressing our feelings. It's all of these things, something we can all play a role in. And every aspect of society can as well.
Yeah, it's similarly to loss, when we've lost someone and we ask the question why. On the other side, with people who are still with us, we focus, suicide prevention specifically focuses so much on if. Can I predict this?
Yes.
Is this going to happen? And instead, how?
Right.
How are you suffering?
Well, and then the question really gets down to, we do not have to be able to predict it in order to prevent it. And, if we have the right, I shouldn't say the right, because there's not necessarily a black and white thinking, but if we have practices that help people, that invite them to seek help, that provide opportunities for them to get help, then we're doing something. We don't have to know, who is at imminent risk right at any particular time. If we have all these things in place. After I looked at Columbine and what happened, and I began to examine that every entity in my son's life played a role. For example, he had gone to his family doctor with a sore throat a couple months before he died. Now, what if that family doctor had done a routine suicide screening? Would that have done something? Would that have been a red flag? Obviously the school did things that probably would not have, that were not helpful, and he might have done other things. I, as a parent, could have spoken with my son differently and interacted with him differently. He had been arrested for stealing something a year, 14 months before he died. He was involved with the juvenile justice system. Well, they didn't know and didn't tell me that he was at increased risk of suicide just because of the fact that he had gotten in trouble with the law. So every aspect of society, his contacts with the medical community, the school, criminal justice, on and on and on, everybody could have played a role that might have stepped in and might have prevented what happened.
Yeah. Yeah, and it's, oh God, I don't know. I think when we see things like this, yeah, there's this need to cast blame. And of course, he did it, but
Yeah.
there should be a looking back at us and at society. Society is not, um, uh, we are doing this to each other.
Mhm.
And I can't not think of that when I think about what Dylan and Eric did and
Mhm.
what all of these people have done since. Um, and even the ways we talk about these events when they happen, there are there are all kinds of things that come into play. White supremacy, like this obsession with mental illness, toxic masculinity,
Mhm. Mhm. That's true.
Um, and we don't want to talk about that though.
Mhm.
Yeah.
One of the things I've had been challenged by in the last 20 years is that this whole issue of mental illness versus mental wellness and what it is. I know that I had heard a psychiatrist talk at a conference I went to, and she had said, if we are, if we're hallucinating, if we are, psychotic, you can go to an emergency room and say something is wrong. They know what to do. They can address it. They can diagnose it. But if you have a young boy who's secretly planning his own death and the death of other people, if he's amassing weapons, you can't go to your local mental health facility and say he needs help, because there's that's not a diagnosable thing. So what I am trying to do and to work toward is to help people understand in general what is mentally healthy thinking and what is not.
Mm.
And I want to make it very clear when I speak to people that just if you are having obsessive thoughts about suicide or about a plan for how you're going to take your life, perceive that as a symptom that something is wrong. That is not a healthy or a normal way to be thinking all the time about how you intend to die, or in other cases, certainly how you intend to take the lives of other people.
Mm.
It's not a diagnosable thing. It's not in the DSM. You can't go find that. But something should tell us that that is not healthy and that we need help. So this has been one of the challenges, is that I believe that Dylan was not in his right mind.
Mhm.
Yet I can't simply write it off and just say, oh, he did this because he was depressed or because he had an undiagnosed mental illness, because most people who have those things don't do what he did. But
Right.
I believe that when an event like this happens, it's very complex and it's a confluence. It's the perfect storm of all these things happening. Being willing to die or preparing to die or having a life indifference, so that if you are enraged, if you have a friend who is very homicidal and wants to make a plan for some kind of vengeance because you've experienced something, these pieces fall into place.
Mm-hmm.
So, we can't ever look at this as a simple thing. Another thing you were saying I wanted to comment, and that is the whole issue of blame. Of course, when we lose loved ones to suicide, we blame ourselves. I don't know of anybody who hasn't lost a loved one to suicide who doesn't in some way blame themselves.
Yeah.
But one of the difficult things for me to live with was that I was being blamed by others for this. And I was just the kind of person that wanted to be so perfect. I mean, I didn't have enemies. I just felt like I had done everything to the best of my abilities. And it was really hard for me to turn on the radio and hear people calling me disgusting and evil and incompetent. And our family was sued by 36 families. So in general, the public opinion was that this was my fault.
Mm-hmm.
And what I came to believe over time was that before this happened to me, I believe very strongly that I would have been doing the same thing to someone else. I would have been saying, I raised my child. I was a good mother. I was a good communicator. And if I had not experienced this myself, I would not have realized the naivete of a statement like that. And I believe that when people blame others, for things that their families do. They do it out of fear. They want to believe that those people are really different from themselves, because that makes them feel that this couldn't happen to me because I'm a good mom, and that person must not have been a good mom, or this wouldn't have happened. I think without without any doubt that that is part of what they're experiencing, is the need to feel safe and the need to feel that this couldn't possibly happen to them. So I've learned to live with that a little bit more easily, because I recognize their fear, and think I would have been the same person. I would have done the same thing and said the same thing.
Yeah, I mean, in the suicide field, we're driven by fear, driven so deeply by fear, as I think to cause harm when we're trying to prevent it sometimes.
Go a little more with that.
Um,
Give me your perspective on that.
well, when I think about, we all set out to save lives in the suicide
Yes.
prevention field. What does it mean to save a life? Does it mean you cart someone off and throw them in the hospital, despite having a whole body of evidence that says hospitalizing someone can be traumatic on a number of levels, and when they get out, then their suicide risk skyrockets too?
Yes.
Is that saving a life, or is that prolonging a life? What is it? What is our motive? But I think that need to like hold on, to cling to someone you love, of course, is driven by fear, and you'll do anything to keep them alive, but it's like, at what cost?
Yes, that's true. It's true.
And it's fear. It's fear.
I think fear is at the root of so many evils. I think part of what we experience as human beings, even when we look at our own shortcomings, or we have a bullying incident, or whatever it is, life is sort of it's so layered, so that when we have something we experience that's difficult, we have feelings about that. But then the very next thing that happens is we have feelings about those feelings. And that's where we all, I think, get into trouble, is, what are our feelings and reactions to what we just felt? Yeah. And that's where panic and anxiety come from, where because you feel fear and you're scared to death of feeling fear, so you panic. But I think, that's where I think that's where a lot of rage comes from. And that's where a lot of, targeted anger and dehumanization of other people, because for some reason they represent a threat to us, and we're responding to that feeling with, we're afraid of it. So it kicks in and flips around again and becomes anger. It becomes blame. It becomes all these other things. But I think fear is at the root of an awful lot of our world's problems.
I agree. Very much. Yeah. So, well, I know one of the things that I emailed you about, like when we were talking about doing this, was that I was really interested in, and I've read about this in other situations too, and when an event like this happens, or rather, an event like this, in the instance of Columbine, when the news, started coming through about what happened, you were at work, I believe, and then when you went home, you were sequestered.
Yes.
Yes.
We really didn't know what was happening. I was at work when I got the call from my husband that something terrible was going on at school, and they believed he'd been in touch with the sheriff's department, and they believed that Dylan might be one of the perpetrators of whatever was going on. And I came home from work. A SWAT team and a detective, I think, came to our home and asked us to leave. And it was a beautiful spring day, but we were outside, and we lived in the country and were surrounded by rocks. So we had a very private space, but we were not allowed in our house for the entire day. We had to sit outside on the ground, or in cars. And later we learned that was because they were afraid that there might be bombs in our house, or explosives of some kind. But we weren't in any shape to process any of this, so that when we heard that, we thought, well, that's stupid, like, why would they think that? But so we didn't understand what was going on. We were not allowed, we didn't listen to the news or the TV because we were outside. And the only thing I remember all day long was asking the police that were there from the sheriff's department over and over again, is my son okay? You know, and I asked again and again, you know, is Dylan dead? And finally, it was late afternoon, and one of them did tell me. I don't know if he was even allowed to or not, but I kept asking, and finally I said, is Dylan dead? And he said yes. And then my second question was, how did he die? And he said, I don't know. And so I was in shock. So I spent the whole day sitting on the ground outside, crying and asking over and over again if my son was okay. That was all, you know, that was about it. I remember helicopters going over. I remember parked on the road in front of my house, hundreds of cars, and news media was gathering from all over the world as soon as they could get there. I was in a fishbowl, and I didn't even understand what had happened or what was going on or what it meant to me. It would take a long time. It takes a long time in those conditions to even know what you're dealing with. All I could think of was something's happened to my child. I mean, I hadn't even begun to focus on what he might be doing to other people or what could be happening. I didn't know.
Yeah.
I did hear at one point during the day through an open window, I remember the news misreporting saying that 25 people were believed to be dead. And that was false. But I just heard that. And again, I'm thinking, what does Dylan have to do with all this? You know, how could he be there? And I was so convinced that he wasn't responsible for what happened, that it was some kind of a senior prank gone wrong, or maybe Eric planned something and tricked him. I mean, I was in denial for months, thinking, you know, I'd hear all these horrible stories of what was said at the scene and what was done, and I kept thinking, well, Dylan couldn't have done that. It must have been Eric. And then when I finally got the police report 6 months later, and I really did hear all the terrible things that were said and done, I began grief all over again because I was suddenly grieving for a different person.
Yeah. Yeah. Just as you talk about it, it's almost like there are so many different kinds of grief that just layered, like, what do they call it? Misplaced grief. When you don't even know what's happened, you don't know if you should be upset or what you should be upset about.
Right. And that happens with trauma so often because everything's coming at you. And this process of integration, of sorting it out, putting things where they belong so that you have a construct for your grief, that just takes time and work. You have to work at that to try to figure it out.
Yeah.
And I didn't know any of the people who were hurt or killed at that time. And I didn't even learn until later that evening when they started to talk about how many were killed, how many were wounded. And I remember starting to read the paper the next morning, and I couldn't do it. I mean, I was just, I can't believe I could think of all these innocent kids and, you know, what Dylan was being accused of. And the denial was so strong. It was just like, no, this could not have been my son. He could not have done that. It took a long time for me to be able to say, yes, it was my son murdered people in a horrible, horrible way. And I can't tell you why. I think people expected there, as we always do, people expect there to be a simple answer so that you can find somebody to blame. Yeah. But life isn't that. Life doesn't make things that easy.
Yeah. Yeah. I think of that story with you not knowing so often because, as I said, Columbine affected me. I think I was a sophomore in high school when that happened, and we were getting news. I was across the country from you, watching the news, hearing about the Trenchcoat Mafia and all of these things, and you didn't know. Like, you had no idea the loss that happened to you, that happened to your community, and it baffles me.
Yeah.
It baffles me.
Yeah. And one of the other things I think we experienced, that's not everybody, so few people do experience this, but that is family members of perpetrators are not perceived as victims of tragedies. So even, and the sheriff's department treated us very respectfully, I must say, they really did. But there would be times like, for example, they made it possible for the victims of the tragedy, their family members, to go into the school to see where their loved ones had died. And they contacted them to let them know that, but we weren't contacted because we're not considered victims. We're the perpetrator's family. And because my son had died in that room also, it took someone, and I knew through our attorney's office, to contact them and request, can the Klebold family go to and see where their son died? And of course they were kind and said yes. But whenever there were things that were for the victims of the tragedy, we were always, of course, just set apart, that we're not considered victims of that tragedy. Likewise, we don't qualify for victims assistance, so that, when we're in pieces and trying to figure out how to go on with our lives, that we don't get that kind of support. Now, I don't know now with just even family suicides, is victims assistance usually involved with that or not?
I'm not sure, and I think that may be a state-to-state policy.
Yeah, it's a regional thing. Yeah.
Yeah, I'm not sure.
Because the perception is that person chose to do this. And that goes back to that choosing thing, that they were willful. They willfully chose to do this. Therefore, we don't mourn them in the same way. And I believe that they are victims of their thinking. They are victims of their brains malfunctioning at that point. And they are victims. But that's just the way I've processed that for myself.
Right. Well, it's funny. I mean, I just had two thoughts. There's the first thought was, some of what you said goes back to this ritual idea, but more immediately what I'm thinking of is the being able to hold multiple realities that aren't exclusive to one another. And bullying. God, bullying was one of the things that came up all the time around Dylan and Eric. And the research that we have out there says that people who are bullied are at risk. Bullies are at risk. People who do both are at the highest risk.
Yeah, I know. Of course, I was not aware of any of that before all this happened.
I don't think any of us were, right?
No.
Yeah. But that idea that you can be a victim and a perpetrator is just so hard to hold, I think, for a lot of people.
Yeah, it's true.
Yeah, it's just such a gray area.
And from a parent's perspective, Dylan, we weren't really aware that he was being bullied. We were aware that he had a conflict with some kids at one point at school. And, he scratched a locker. He got in trouble. We didn't understand or even know how to ask if, are you being bullied? But one of the problems with bullying is that they relive their trauma and their shame by having to explain to you that they're being bullied. They're afraid you're going to go to the school and make things worse for them, where they have to confront either those who are bullying them or the people in authority. So I'm sure that even if I had known this, I probably wouldn't have handled it right. I mean, I didn't know those things then. And so I think that is what cemented this bond that Dylan and Eric had, was that, yes, Dylan had a lot of friends, and he'd gone to a prom 4 days before he died, and with 6 couples in a limousine, and he danced, and they went out for dinner, and he told me that morning he'd had the best time he'd ever had in his life, and he thanked me for sending him. 3 days later, he was dead. But this issue of believing that they were bullied, I think some of the incidents that occurred with Dylan and Eric, where they were shoved around or knocked down or squirted with ketchup or whatever the incident was, a lot of these things happened when they were not with their friends. They didn't have the support of their group. And And I think that just created this sense of rage and desire for vengeance in the two of them. So
yeah, I can see that. What was I? Now I can't remember. I was trying to remember what you said about ritual. Oh, the when you were talking about going into the school, wanting to see where he died. Two thoughts came up, and we were talking about this before we started recording, but that link of needing ritual when somebody dies, and what do you do when you don't get it?
yeah.
And that, sounds like that was some of your experience back then, and then linking it back to COVID and how so many of us who have lost someone in the past year haven't been able to grieve, to have those rituals.
Right. Yeah, I think in Dylan's case, we didn't want a funeral. We didn't want a grave because we were afraid it would be vandalized. And we did end up having a small private ceremony with I think there were 12 of us there. It was very small, where we just talked about, the stories. And we had a pastor there who, led us. And but what I, over the years, really developed for myself was a personal ritual. I mean, we planted a special memorial garden behind our house with a tree and, bricks and a little plaque it said some things on it. And I got to this place in my life, and I still do it, where I try to sort of dedicate what I do to the cause of trying to help my son. And even before I give a speech or, do a webinar or do anything, I always take a moment and try to say to myself, what could I say to anyone so that that person might be able to help somebody like Dylan? It would change their awareness. So I think that our rituals can be very personal. I mean, anytime I make a pie that's his favorite kind, or make a kettle of soup that's his favorite kind, I mean, these are the little things I do. And, I remember you, I honor you. You used to love this, and I have 1,000 little points of private little rituals where I just say, this is for you. This is for you, Dylan. Or I'm doing this in honor of you. And that's what I have come to do over these 20 plus years.
Yeah, that's sweet. Yeah, I remember, just learning about these ideas kind of academically probably right before the pandemic started, and really starting to think about it. Because when I think of the word ritual, I'm kind of like, not my thing. But when my grandfather died, I remember having to kind of figure it out and embrace it, because I couldn't go be with my family. I couldn't go be with him. And he's one of the people that I've feared the most dying. Like, his death is something I feared since almost 20 years, and finally happened. And I never thought that I wouldn't be able to hold his hand.
Yes.
And I had to find different ways. I had to have flowers and a candle in his picture. Now I keep
exactly a little shrine, a little place where you. And I had the same thing for Dylan. I had, candles. I had some little things he'd made in art class. I had a picture of him. And his room was there. We would go up and sit in his room. So yeah, I think those things are really important and essential. And the other thing I tell people, if they're really suffering and grieving, is that it's an important thing to do, to suffer, to get through this. Because if you try to get through your grief and have it not touch you and feel good all the time, it doesn't work that way. That it's, it's like the metal that has to go through the fire to be strong. You have to feel what your heart wants to feel. And yes, it feels awful, but the more you do that, the opposite becomes true, and you are lifted up, you get stronger, you are able to help other people.
Mhm.
So I think grief and sorrow, they're horrible, difficult feelings, but they're important feelings to have. And like childbirth, it hurts, but there's an upside, you end up with a baby.
A
So
screaming, pooping potato.
yes.
Yeah, and Eastern philosophy is founded on that idea. All life is suffering.
Mhm.
I can't remember if it's Hinduism or Buddhism, so I'm showing my
I know.
memory,
Yeah.
but yeah, that suffering and grief, and yeah, I don't think you can get out of life without grief, and the idea that a person would stop grieving over, I don't know, any major
Yeah.
loss. I just think it changes you, right?
Yeah, and I had this sensation of carrying Dylan with me through life, and I remember distinctly feeling that of, he is with me, he is a part of me. Um, I heard somebody say somewhere, and I wish I could quote the source, but I can't. But someone had said that when we lose our parents, we bury them in the ground, but when we lose our children, we bury them in our hearts. And
Mm.
I thought, and not to diminish in any way the loss of a parent, but I mean, I do feel that as a parent, our role is to care for them, protect them, keep them safe, keep them with us. And I think in particular with children, we do have a need to carry them for the rest of our lives, more so than parents, because because I've lost both of my parents years ago, and it's a different kind of a grief to lose a child and to lose a parent.
Yeah, 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 and I keep referring to the conversation we had before we started.
Yeah, we should have had the thing running.
I should have said, but yeah, like I said, Columbine it's changed everything. Number one, everything, and I've always it played this important role in my life, and now that I'm a parent, I have to think about, well, I'm going to send my kids into a building where someone inside the building could hurt them, someone outside the building could hurt them. Trainers could come in and train them to lock doors and traumatize them in the training.
Yes.
My God, those trainings. I think I'm more afraid of the trainings almost than the possibility of the actual event.
Right. And the trainings, they're controversial, and
That was I think
the
it is.
kind of trainings that some of them are so graphic and traumatizing that I think it does more harm than good.
Yeah.
But I think some kind of preparedness without frightening them is also a good thing.
Yes.
But we have to remember that even though the school shootings are highly publicized and we are bombarded on the news with them, they are still rare.
Yeah.
And that's still the safest place I can think of for your child to be. I mean, we're not safe in any restaurant, any mall, any McDonald's. I'm always watchful. I always watch the door. I remember being in a Burger King one day, and a young woman came in angry and started yelling at somebody who was sitting there. And I got out of this that they had some kind of a relationship, and he started yelling, and they stood up as if they were going to hurt each other. And I bolted. I mean, I just bolted because I thought, I know how these things can get. And I left the room because I felt frightened by that. But yeah, this can happen anywhere, anytime. This is America. And we have an illusion that we are safe when I don't believe that we really are.
Yeah.
All the time.
We're neither safe nor do we have privacy.
Yes.
I got sidetracked by talking about the trainings, but it was what I meant to say. What I wanted to say was more about how just that event affects the motherhood and or rather being a mother and knowing that it happened, makes you think about, like, what would happen if I lost my kid? What would happen if my kid was the person who perpetrated the loss of other kids. What, all of
Yeah.
it. Um,
Yeah.
and then, of course, yeah, we're not safe. And after Columbine, it was Aurora, and then Las Vegas. And no, really, we have proof that we are at San Diego. He was running people over. I think yeah, there's proof that we're not safe anywhere. Well,
Yeah.
maybe we're safe in our own houses now that we can't leave them. I don't know. No, that's not true either.
Well, part of death or grief work is accepting death, accepting mortality.
Mm-hmm.
And that is, to me, that is very much of what I had to work on in the years afterward, because I think we get this feeling, I believe it was Iris Bolton that said, we kind of believe our children are immortal, that if we love them enough, they're going to be fine, everything's going to be fine. And I learned, number one, that love is not enough to keep somebody safe. And number two, we are all finite. We all die. And that is something you have to really work on in accepting grief, because until you do lose someone, that whole concept of death and not seeing them again, and wondering, where they are, what they're doing, if they are doing something, it doesn't really enter our sphere until we start missing someone who's left us. And I think for me, for a lot of the grief process was really working on the whole concept of death, and the fact that we are only here a short time and we move on. And that's a necessary part for me to try to understand that Dylan was on this earth a while and he left. And I remember one lady saying to me, I was at work, and this woman I talked to, she said, how's your day going? And I said, well, I think it was an anniversary date of some kind. It was either Dylan's birthday or it was something. And I said, well, I'm not doing very well today. I said, I'm really sad today because I miss my son, and I'm just really sad. And she said to me, well, I think you should be thankful. You had him for 17 years and I never had any children. So she said, maybe you should think about it, that he was a gift to your life. And I was like, what a great way to think about that, So it's all in how you frame this.
I would not have enjoyed that.
No, I listened. I did. It helped me. Because I thought, I have to look at, what a gift he was to me. And what if he had not been in my life? Yes, he brought me and so many people, all this suffering. But, to think of that time we had is a blessing. And I am better thinking like that. I do better thinking like that.
Yeah. It takes me back to the thought of suicide too. When we lose somebody, with Live Through This, I've interviewed almost 200 people, and over time, I knew that the likelihood of losing someone to suicide who I had interviewed, just statistically was going to go higher and higher. And it took 6 years until we lost Natalie, and now we've lost 5 more people. And I think a pattern has emerged in those losses. And I think that when we talk about people who struggle for a long time with something, or who endured traumas, or whatever reason they had to go, reasons, whatever it was, it's I have to think of it as every day they woke up was a triumph.
Yes.
Because it is a tragedy, but there had to be a certain amount of pain preceding that tragedy for it to happen. And I think about how that was a triumph. And I wish people were able to do that more often, but I probably still would have clocked that lady. So
actually, I was taken aback, but it brought me a sense of gratitude. So yeah. I appreciated that comment.
Well, it's making meaning, right?
Yeah.
What about I mean, like I was saying, the layers of grief. What about that feeling of having a community and then not having a community? Because that's the sense I get, that after this happened, you had to wall yourself off, or maybe others walled you off, or
I did not lose anyone who was close to me.
mm-hmm.
And that is not true for everyone who goes through losses similar to this, or even suicides. The people that I cared about stayed with me, family and friends. They closed ranks around me. They protected me. They took care of me. What I lost was the illusion that I was connected to a larger community.
Right.
And yet, even out there among the larger community, I got kind letters from people all over the world. I still do. So I know that there are people who relate to me, who relate to Dylan,
Mm-hmm.
and they are supportive and they are kind. And that is, that is a large community that I still feel connected with.
Mm.
The difficulty for me is always, I find it very difficult to connect with hatred, with people who hate me or who hate others. Because to me, that's a kind of dehumanization, where you have reduced someone down to a particular characteristic about them, and you have chosen to judge that person and hate them. And I don't relate to that. But for the most part, I was very fortunate. I mean, as I said, I didn't lose any friends at all. People took care of me. My neighbors brought food. My friends came over, and I had gotten thousands of letters, and people helped me sort through them and read them. And I couldn't be more grateful for the love and support that I did get. And it helped me to try to tune out some of the nastiness that was going on, and the brutality of what some people were saying. And I just ducked and covered. There was no social media then. Can you imagine if there had been? But
Yes.
I'm not. I don't. To this day, I don't use it. But by shutting myself off, by not watching the news and not reading the paper, I was able to build a little bubble around myself and try to protect myself from that extra traumatic piece of being scared and being hated and being hurt and being threatened. And if it really is something where I get threatened, I just call the police. I call the sheriff's department and treat it as anybody else would.
Right. That still happens.
Occasionally.
Oh.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, you never left, did you?
Mm-mm.
Wow.
No, I still live right here. Right here.
Same house and everything?
I moved out because my husband and I got a divorce. And but I thought about changing my name and leaving and trying to become anonymous. But I realized that all it would take would be one person to go, oh, do you know who that woman is? And my cover would be blown. And I really thought about trying to become someone else. And for me, there were too many losses involved with that. I would have to leave my family, my support, my career, my friends. And I decided that I needed to stay where I was for myself. And that lying to other people didn't work. I was still carrying the truth in my heart. And I felt that perhaps it might be better to just own it. And I remember the first meeting I was in, when we introduced ourselves in this meeting, and I said my name, and someone in the room said, Klebold, why does that sound so familiar? And I was in this whole room around this conference table with people I did and didn't know. Mm-hmm. And I remember thinking, this is your fork in the road. This is your place where you can try to hide this, or you can own it. And I remember saying, oh, you must be thinking of my son, Dylan, who was Dylan Klebold, and he was one of the shooters in the Columbine High School tragedy. And everybody was in their seats going, oh my God, but, and the person took it very graciously, and the meeting went on as if nothing had happened. And that's when I said, this is who I am. I have to own it. I can't run from this. And that's what made that start.
Yeah. Well, wherever you go, there you are, or whatever, right?
Yes. Isn't that the truth? Yeah.
Apparently. I mean, well, I could talk to you forever. Tell me more about, inevitably this grief colored everything you do. It colors every day you live. What legacy are you leaving behind with this grief? Tell me more about that. With this grief and the work that's come out of it, I mean.
Yes, I don't think the grief itself produces a legacy. It's what I do with the grief that produces the legacy.
Yeah.
When I wrote my book, I donated all of my profits from the book to organizations that promote or help with suicide prevention, mental health, and brain research. So that was one of my legacies. I wanted to take those chunk of funds that I wouldn't have had and give them to organizations that work on this thing. So I felt that was good, that I felt pleased that I was able to do that. The other thing that I think is a piece of my legacy that I want people to understand is that I was living in a fool's paradise, I think, before this happened, because of all of my belief systems. I believed that loving someone enough was protective, that if you loved them enough, they wouldn't possibly hurt themselves or anybody else. I believed that I was a good mother. I believed that I had a good relationship with my kids and that they could communicate with me easily. And I have the stage because I always said I was a freak show. People want to see this woman who was the mother of this killer, so they will listen to me or look at me or look me up online. And then if I have their attention, then I will try to say, these are the things I wish I had done differently. I wish I had acknowledged my son's feelings. I wish I hadn't been so quick to try to help somebody when the real thing I needed to do was just to shut up and listen and let them express what they were feeling. And to try to help people see that, we can't always see what someone is thinking, and they're very good at hiding it. Mm-hmm. And don't make the assumption that because you tell someone you love them every day, that they love themselves or that they feel loved. Those are the kind of things I want to do, that if I can help somebody understand what somebody they love might be going through. Oh, do we have a visitor? Then that's what I hope is my legacy. And I'm sorry, you just saw a cat tail go by the picture. This is my cat.
Fine. One thing I love about the pandemic and kind of living our lives on Zoom is you get to see parts of people that you just never would have otherwise. Animals, babies. I mean,
yes. Messy rooms.
Yeah, when I'm in class, my babies are like, they're hanging on me. It's I don't know. It's kind of fun. It's something I hope we get to keep. What's Kitty's name?
Harley.
Harley. Good.
Harley. Yes.
Guess I have a couple more questions. I know I've taken up a bit of your time today.
That's all right.
I'm thinking about peers. My whole everything is based on peer support and lived experience and the power of those bonds. And you mentioned earlier talking to others who have been through similar events. I don't know. Just tell me more about that. How does being a part of a community like that help you process or anything? Speak on
it. The likelihood that you would have a child who would commit a mass murder, mass shooting, is probably, it's one in millions.
Yeah.
So my experience, of course, I felt quite isolated because there wasn't a peer group where I could connect with. But when I learned that my son's death was a suicide, and then we saw in his writings that the sheriff's department had taken that I didn't know existed, that when he was 15, he was talking about being in agony and wanting to get a gun and wanting to end his life. I began to identify as a suicide loss survivor. And for me, getting connected to the suicide loss community was a lifesaver, because when this happens to us and we lose a loved one to suicide, it makes us feel that we are living on our own planet, that nobody can possibly understand what we're feeling, what we're thinking. And I surrounded myself with opportunities to be with other suicide loss survivors. I was not able to go to a support group because of the lawsuits. We were being sued, and I couldn't go to a support group and talk about this because it would have made witnesses out of everybody in the support group if this went to trial. And so I had to do it in a different way. And I ended up going to luncheons and conferences and hearing speakers and reading books. So my connection to the suicide loss survivor community was pivotal. I mean, it was the thing that made me feel that I was part of a tribe, that I had other people that had experienced that. And I also learned in the mental health world, I think peer support is just about the most important thing there is. I remember several years after the shootings, I started having really bad panic attacks and PTSD symptoms, and just, I was a wreck. And I remember reading somewhere that there was this person who had had panic attacks for years and years and had gotten them under control, and he'd written a book, and that was Dr. Stephen Hayes. And I bought that book, and I carried it with me like a stuffed animal. You know, it was one of these things, because I thought, well, if I have a panic attack, I know his book will help me, because he lived through it, I can live through it too. Mm. And it was just this feeling of someone who had suffered, who had experienced what you're experiencing, and they're still standing and they're okay. And I think in the community where we are struggling with mental health issues, that is so important to believe that someone else got through it, I can get through it too. And I carried that book with me in my suitcase when I traveled. I never did read the whole book, but I just remembered carrying it with me like some kind of a golden key, that, you know, if I read this book and he tells me how to do this, I can do it. And that just reduced the fear so much. It was remarkable. So yeah, I think it's very important to see that people can get through this. And I do try to help if I get personal referrals from people I know, other murder suicide loss survivors, and I talk with them. And it helps them to know that, yes, you can live through this. It's the same thing you're talking about. I love that, live through this concept. I think it's right on.
Yeah. I think I remember the first conference. I've still never been able to see you speak. I'm always presenting when we're at a conference at the same time. But I remember hearing, I think for the first time, you were presenting with Stephanie Willard.
Yes. Mm-hmm.
Who is also going to come on and talk to me.
Yes.
What were you going to say? You sounded like you were going to
I was just going to say that when we talk about homicide, suicide, or murder, suicide, how very different those stories are. Because in my case, my son killed people that I did not know. And in Stephanie's case, of course, she lost a husband and a child. Yeah. So they bring very different kinds of traumas and life-altering circumstances under the umbrella of murder-suicide. And very often you can lose more than one family member, or have a whole branch of your family wiped out from these incidents. So they're all horrible in different ways.
Yeah, I think one of the most, I was telling someone this recently, one of the most powerful presentations I've ever been a part of it kind of speaks to that. It's in the suicide world, and in life, we just want to put everyone in a neat little box.
So much easier.
Yeah. And in the suicide prevention world, there kind of is often this silo of people who have lived experience of suicidal ideation or attempts or whatever, and then loss survivors. And there's almost in some cases, a hostility sometimes.
Yes, I think there has been. Yeah. And I think it's around fear. I think fear is rearing its head there, but yes.
Yeah, and I've heard people say, you know, well, maybe I don't want to be around attempt survivors because why you and not my person?
Exactly. Yeah.
And I get that. Also, it's horrible, but I get it.
Yeah.
But being on this panel with I think it was me as an attempt survivor and a loss survivor. Stephanie was on the panel. We had Bart Andrews, who is a psychologist and an attempt survivor, and April Foreman, who is a clinician loss survivor, and just talking about this kind of tapestry of loss almost. There is something essential there that I think is really beautiful when we can all come together and talk about those things. That's why I think, you know, even though the losses that you and Stephanie and, you know, I mean, what almost every murder suicide situation is unique. But when we're able to kind of tap into that essential piece.
Well, and it was an attempt survivor, I think, who helped me tremendously in the beginning. I was at work, another work story, but we had cubicles, so of course there's no privacy. You can hear every phone call, you can hear everything. And I was talking to somebody about how, you know, I said Dylan could not have loved me. He could not have cared about any of us if he could do what he did. And this very dear lady after work stopped by and said, you know, I couldn't help but overhear what you were saying. And she said, you know, I was an attempt survivor. I was hospitalized. And she said, I think it was believed, she said 3 or 4 young children and had just had a divorce. And she said, I remember thinking that my children would be better off if I were dead. And she said, it's not that I didn't love them. It's not that they didn't mean the world to me, but my thinking was so distorted. And she, you know, of course it broke my heart and I was sobbing, but I mean, she was the one that said, don't think that if someone dies by suicide, it's because they didn't love you, you know. And it was so helpful for her to say that to me. It was tremendously helpful. I needed to hear it.
Yeah. That's not surprising to me. There's with any of these kinds of losses, I think there's just a tremendous capacity for empathy that we might not otherwise have. One or two things. So I feel like you've implied that you've had your own suicidal ideation in the intervening years.
When I was experiencing uncontrolled panic, anxiety attacks, that was when I considered it. I cannot say that I never got to a place where I was moving toward it or making a plan. I remembered thinking, I can't live like this. If this doesn't stop, I'm not going to be able to survive it. That was as close as I came to suicidal thinking and ideation. But it was just this excruciating feeling that I was having that I couldn't bear to have, because in the middle of these attacks, at least with mine, it would be like this rat wheel that would go and go and go, and I couldn't get it to stop, and it was terrifying, and it was a sense of, you know, free fall, and I didn't like it, and I was afraid of it, and I remember thinking, if I can't get this under control, I can't live with this, and that helped me understand a little bit about where one is when one is use the word considering, when one is approaching, you know, thinking about ending one's life. I mean, I really felt that was the only option I might have left.
Yeah. Panic attacks and anxiety like that. Well, that's beyond anxiety, but insidious.
It's awful. It's the worst. It's horrible. Yeah.
Yeah, I was just curious about that, but that's a fantastic point. When I first experienced panic attacks, I was working at Bennigan's. I don't know if you guys ever had those.
Bennigan's, yes.
Bennigan's, yeah.
I remember that. Yeah.
Yeah. And we had had terrible turnover, and we were understaffed, and so I was working doubles 3 or 4 times a week, and I started to have panic attacks because I was also a full-time student. Yeah, it was bad. And I used to love that potato soup. But my boss would sit me down when I'd say I need to go home, and, you know, sobbing, holding a tray of drinks, can't breathe, and she's like, just have some of this potato soup and some soda water and you'll be better and you can get back to work. And I was like,
Oh,
That was
yes.
fun.
It's our move. Yes. Yeah.
That's unrelated, but yeah. I guess I'm glad Bennigan's isn't around anymore, or at least, because I would be sad about the potato soup. So one of the things, one of the reasons, or the main reason, I guess, that I wanted to do this was because I feel like I'm lacking the education around grief that I think is so necessary to be going into clinical work, and I do want to specialize in working with loss of various kinds, and I'm pissed about it. I think we deserve this education, and I think if there were more therapists out there who understood loss and panic attacks and suicidality and all that, I think we'd all be in a lot better shape. But where does that come from? Like where do we need, beyond education, like where do we need improvement? Is it policy for specifically like for say mass shootings or whatever kind of grief you think is relevant to speak to on this? But is it policy change? Is it the education? Is it, what do communities need to know? Like, what do you think? I don't know. That's a big question.
I'm a volunteer for the American Foundation for Suicide Prevention. I'm on their Loss and Healing Council. And it is our focus to try to provide support and help for lost survivors, those of us who have lost loved ones to suicide in particular. And one of the things we have discussed, and this is a long way of saying I don't have an answer for you, but they have a program called the Healing Conversations Program, where a volunteer could come to your house who is also a loss survivor, or can meet you on the phone or Skype or whatever, and bring you resources and just talk a little bit about suicide loss. And we've been discussing this same idea of based on types of loss. For example, what do we do if you have someone who is a murder-suicide loss survivor, or has lost a sibling, or has lost a child? And it all gets back to, I believe, somehow we need to find ways to connect people to people who have had similar experiences and similar losses, because I'm such a big believer in the power of peer support. So how we do that, I don't know. I don't think it's realistic as a therapist to be trained in everything. I don't think you can do it. But I think what you need is a network of people. For example, people that I have known through the suicide prevention community, many of them are counselors. And if they have a special client who wants to connect with another murder-suicide loss survivor, they can network that and get that person back to me for a conversation. So that's what I think is the ability to know what those niches are and how do you reach each of those niches. I think another really important thing is it's got to be very clear that people are qualified to do what they say they are able to do. So if on a website like a Psychology Today, they say they're a grief expert, that should mean something. That should have some kind of standard. And you should know that if you select that person is going to be well-trained and qualified to help you. And I think that's true for all the subsets of what someone might specialize in, whatever it happens to be. And I don't think we have a real clear set of standards for a lot of these things, and getting that would be helpful.
Yeah. On one hand, I'm like, standards, because only because, I've studied this suicide academically on my own for years, but I don't have the degree. And so some people think I'm not legitimate. And it's like, I could run circles around most people and give you quote, citations and blah, blah, blah. Then on the other hand, I was actually going to bring up what you brought up, Psychology Today. Like, you go on almost, you could type in any name almost on the Psychology Today website, and they're going to give you 23 different specializations. And I'm like, how am I supposed to believe that?
And whether or not, the question of whether or not to believe it, but very often, how do I know what I need? I mean, they may have these specialties, and if I'm in some kind of a crisis and seeking care, how do I know what I'm even looking for?
Yeah.
There's an assumption there that you would know that you need Gestalt therapy or, Jungian therapy, and you might not know why you need those things or whether or not you do. So
Yeah.
I think we have to do a much better job of helping people understand how to select somebody to help them and how to evaluate after a few sessions to know if you're on the right track or if you need to look for somebody else.
That is a huge beef that I have. A lot of the time when people come to me and they're like, I don't know what to do. I don't have anyone. Can you get me a referral? Number one, I mean, most mental health clinicians are not trained to deal with suicide at all, or if they
Right.
have any training. And number two, we are just not educated on this. So I feel like I'm constantly saying, okay, you got to do a consult. You got to think about what's most important to you. You got to think about this kind of like a dating relationship. There's got to be a rapport there. How do you want to be communicated with? What are your boundaries? For suicidal people, it's, have you dealt with a suicidal person before? And are you going to collaborate with me? And if I come in and I do want to kill myself,
Right.
or are you just going to cart me off?
Right.
And yeah, when do you do the breakup?
Yeah.
That's so important.
Yeah.
So
And I
important.
think another way to look at this is in the realm of, let's look at like physical care. We have orthopedic surgeons, we have massage therapists, we have acupuncturists, we have workout coaches, we have all these things that are a piece of this care for our bodies concept. I believe we have not done a good job yet at trying to figure out who are the players when it comes to self-care for our minds. And it might be a peer counselor is just what you need. It might be an app on your phone is just what you need. It might be a visit to a psychiatrist is just what you need. But how do we know that? We don't have enough standards for that yet. Like I know when I might call a physical therapist. I know when I might go to my doctor and ask for an MRI. But in terms of mental wellness, we really don't have a clear picture of where you are in this process, who to call. And I think perhaps if we look at the how of service delivery, we might be able to find a solution to what you're talking about.
Yeah. Yeah. And we also have that piece. I actually think this quote is from a Sandy Hook survivor who was a researcher. And I think that he said something like, we know about as much about the brain as we know more about the ocean floor than we do the brain.
Yeah. Yeah.
And I think that's that's a huge part of it. Not to mention, I think there was some sort of policy in place where there were researchers couldn't do much around gun violence. So all of these pieces, how are we going to know who to go to if we don't even have the basics down?
Right.
That's so hard.
I know.
It's so hard. The brain is just such a complicated and troublesome and amazing organ.
It is. Excuse me, I've got to kick the cat out. I'm sorry.
I mean, I think I could talk to you all day, but I think that's all the questions I have for you. Do you feel like there's anything else you want to add that maybe I didn't?
I don't think so. This has really been fun to talk to you. This is the longest conversation we've ever had.
It's true. We've always been doing other stuff.
Yeah. Well, I think there are lots of opportunities here, and I'd love to have more conversations about this because we've got to continue to work together. And we got a long way to go.
Yeah, it's true.